Bueno, bienvenidos al Parque Explora, bienvenidos al iFestival. Estamos muy honrados y muy agradecidos de este maravilloso evento que cada año nos concurre para aprender de escritores, divulgadores, científicos y, bueno, sin duda alguna los más importantes exponentes de las ciencias, de la divulgación, del conocimiento. Entonces, primero un agradecimiento especial a los organizadores y segundo, pues empezar lo más rápido posible porque hoy va a estar muy interesante el tema. David Wallace-Wells inició por un artículo en el 2017 en el New York Magazine en torno al cambio climático. En esencia se planteó una pregunta sobre cómo un vacío que en cierta forma detectó tempranamente sobre cómo todas las noticias en torno al cambio climático de alguna manera retratan escenarios sin duda alarmantes, preocupantes, pero nunca tan alarmantes como deberían ser. El artículo fue tan exitoso, tuvo millones de visitas, que claramente abrió inmediatamente una luz, un espectro de importancia sobre un tema que, si bien se ha hablado mucho de él, nadie lo había hablado con quizás el nivel de urgencia que debería tener. El artículo se llamaba El planeta inhóspito y posteriormente pasaría a ser el título del libro, El planeta inhóspito, en donde, dado el creciente interés que suscitó la publicación, pues permitió de alguna manera profundizar más a responder la pregunta de básicamente qué tan jodido está el mundo, ¿cierto? Qué tan complicada está la situación desde la perspectiva del cambio climático. El libro ha tenido una aceptación sorprendente y, sobre todo, insisto, aunque se ha hablado mucho de cambio climático e incluso aunque muchos piensan, entre otras algunos presidentes, que hay demasiado alarmismo por ahí, resulta que el libro nos da literalmente una bofetada en la cara sobre el nivel de urgencia del problema. O sea, en esencia, la urgencia a la que estamos todos familiarizados realmente no es ni la suficiente, ni la correcta, ni la que deberíamos tener. En pocas palabras, lo que se ha divulgado sobre el cambio climático básicamente trae una mayor, es un escenario muy moderado para el nivel de información que ya la ciencia ha venido recopilando desde el punto de vista económico, agrícola, climático, bueno, social, etc. Entonces vamos a entrar de una vez en conversación y, bueno, yo hablaré en inglés, creo que tenemos un sistema muy bueno de traducción para que esta conversación sea lo más fluido posible. David, good night. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for coming to Colombia. Is this your first time in Colombia?
My first time in Medellín, but not in Colombia. I've been to Cartagena before.
Okay, cool. So that's another spot to take a look. Well, David, we are quite impressed on your book. It's amazing how you have portrayed a more deep sense of urgency of what we should be thinking of. Perhaps one of the biggest questions right now is, well, one scientist he does a publication every year with a big question. And I remember once he said, what we should be concerned of. And I guess that this book is one of these big what things why we should be concerned. So please tell us a little bit how do you came up to this? Because you don't come from the science field, you came as a journalist, and in a way you are fulfilling a big gap that was already there for a couple of years, but just with what you saw has come up with this new perspective. So tell us how do you find out this and what moved you to write on this topic?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your introduction. Thank you all for coming. My apologies for speaking in English. I'm embarrassed to do it, but much better than trying to do it in completely broken Spanish. So we were talking backstage about this question of, I was saying it's been amazing to me actually that nobody had written this book before. There are parts of it that get beyond a survey of the science to think about the way that climate change will affect our politics and our relationship to economics and to technology and our sense of our place in nature and all that. But at its core, it's essentially just a processing of everything that the scientific community knows about the changes that are in store for us. And given how dramatic and terrifying and urgent those changes are, you'd think that someone would have gone through this project before, but they hadn't really. And I felt myself, when I was starting to work on it, very strangely suited to the job, because it's not just that I'm not a scientist, that I'm a general interest magazine writer. It's that I've never thought of myself as an environmentalist. I've never thought of myself as what we call in America a nature person. I've never gone camping. I've never gone on a hike. I've never owned any pets. I lived my whole life, with the exception of university and a little time after, in New York City. And I spent that time, my whole life in New York, thinking that climate change was real, but that it was happening somewhere else, far away, slowly, and in fact that modern life was a fortress that could protect me and everyone I knew from the changes that were coming. And the deeper I got into the material, the more I understood just how diluted each of those understandings was, each of those ideas was. Climate change it's not happening slowly. You may think of it as something that's unfolding over centuries since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but in fact, half of all of the fossil fuel emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have come in just the last 30 years, which is since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC climate change body. We're now seeing those impacts in real time with the incredible wildfires in Australia, the not quite as dramatic but still terrifying ones that hit California last year and the year before, the unprecedented heat waves and typhoons. This is not a story unfolding over centuries. It's a story that's unfolding over decades, which means that our lives will contain almost all of it. When I was born, the planet's climate was stable. Now, 37 years later, we're on the brink of catastrophe because of what has happened in those 37 years. And over the next 30, it'll be up to all of us to determine what kind of future we're going to build for ourselves. Many of these choices, much of that shape of that future will be determined by choices we make this decade and the next decade. And so all of us are incredibly consequential players in this incredibly epic drama, trying to secure a livable future for many generations to come, with the possibility that we could produce a future that was much uglier, much more full of suffering and pain and impoverishment. And that's just the first of the three delusions. The second one was about the scope of change. You know, I heard when I was growing up about climate change, I heard about it primarily in terms of sea level rise and Arctic ice melt. And that made me think that if I was living anywhere but the coast, I would be pretty safe. And someplace like Medellín, we'd be pretty comfortable because sea level rise isn't going to get us here, right? But the more that I understood about the depth of the research, and especially all of these new areas of climate research, the more I understood that this was not a story that you could compartmentalize or escape. It was everywhere and all-encompassing and would transform every aspect of modern life as we know it. So economists studying this say that it's possible by the end of the century, if we don't change course, we could have a global GDP that's 30% smaller than it would be without climate change. They say we could have twice as much war because there's a relationship between conflict and violence, conflict and temperature. That relationship is not just about states, it's also about individuals. So rates of rape and murder and domestic assault go up when it's hotter out, as do rates of schizophrenia and autism and ADHD. Nearly every aspect of mental health and physical health that you can imagine is impacted. We could have hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and we have the permanent loss of all the planet's ice sheets, which could raise sea levels ultimately 80 meters. It would take centuries, but that would flood as much as 80% of the world's major cities. So this is everywhere. You know, the way we produce food could be hit devastatingly hard, where agriculture would only be half as productive as it is today just by the end of the century. Every aspect of life as we know it would be affected. And the third big delusion I had was about the severity. You know, I heard a lot about this level of warming 2 degrees Celsius, which scientists call catastrophic, and island nations of the world call genocide. And whenever I heard about it, I heard those same scientists and advocates saying we needed to do everything we could to avoid that level of warming. They're still saying that. And that gave me the impression that that level, 2 degrees, was about a best case scenario. I'm sorry, a worst case scenario. We should be scared of it, but we needed to avoid it. Given where we are today, I think practically speaking, it's a best case scenario, and that means that we'll be inevitably dealing with a level of warming, again, that scientists call catastrophic, and with good reason. It would mean damages from storms and sea level rise would grow 100-fold. It would mean that we would have 150 million people dying of air pollution, 150 million people. That's 25 holocausts. And that's a best case scenario. How far we get beyond that is totally up to us, and I think it's important always to keep in mind that the scale of some of these terrifying projections, you know, they can seem paralyzingly large. You can almost fall into total despair thinking about them, but they're ultimately a sign of the power that we have over the climate, because if we get there, if we get to this doubling of warfare and halving of agricultural yields, it'll only be because of the choices we make from here, which means we can make other choices too. But ultimately, I wanted to write the book because I thought, while scientists were talking about some of these things, the public was, as I had been just a few years ago, deeply mistaken about how fast this was happening, how compartmentalizable it was, and how bad it was going to be. And as a result, hadn't started thinking about all of the ways beyond science that this would affect our lives. You know, it's not just a matter of extreme weather and heat waves and droughts. If our agricultural yields are really half as bountiful as they are today, there are going to be huge parts of the world that are thrown into regular social disarray and chaos and conflict, and our politics and our geopolitics are going to change as a result. Our sense of our place in nature is changed if we, you know, white Australians living on that continent have long thought that modern society allowed them to completely conquer and overcome the difficulties of that entire continent. Any Australian there living today would tell you that that was a deep delusion, and they have to, as a nation, totally reorient their understanding of their relationship to nature so that they stop thinking of it as something that could be beat back or overcome and start thinking of it as a terrifying force that is present now in all of our lives. And I think every one of us all around the world is going to be making those kinds of recalibrations themselves. For me, the most profound one has been about the hope of progress. You know, I'm an American. I was born in 1982. I came of age in the 1990s in New York City at the flush decade of the post-Cold War American empire. And I was a sophisticated enough left-of-center person to know that none of the things that were being said by Americans about America at that time were really true. But nevertheless, I still thought the future was going to be more prosperous. I thought that globalization was imperfect, but it helped the world grow stronger and grow wealthier. And that if you imagined 3 or 4 or 5 decades down the road, you would be imagining a world that was more just and more equitable than the world that we had come from. Climate change has made me really profoundly rethink that whole narrative of progress, which ultimately I think is the basic promise that the entire West has extended to its own citizens, to those it's colonized, and to those it's tried to bring along for the ride over the last couple of decades with globalization. And I don't yet know what the political and cultural shape of the world would be like if we have to remove that promise of progress and of economic growth and prosperity. But I think that climate change means that we're going to have to start thinking in more far-reaching ways about exactly how we could live without that expectation of new prosperity every decade, new security and new justice following almost inevitably.
one of the things that strikes you when you read the book is the idea of acceleration, how fast things are happening, that even one single generation is able to see dramatic changes around. And that evidences are not only delusions, but real facts on what's going on the whole system, on the whole planet. And at the same time, with all these phenomena happening around, what you are saying about this optimistic perspective, last year we have here to Steven Pinker. He published Enlightenment Now, which is, if you haven't read the book Enlightenment Now, it's En Defensa de la Ilustración, is a compilation of optimism, how good we are doing and how the things are not as bad as we think, in terms of education, in terms of economic growth, in terms of social development, in terms of violence, a lot of topics. And of course, one of the things that are like weak on this perspective is climate change on the planet. There's a very brief mention on this, which in a way, in terms of social and economic development, seems that we are like very good, like growing up in the right direction, like having access to a lot of privilege. But at the same time, perhaps in the underground of that, there is not that silence phenomena of stuff happening around us that will become and increase worse and worse. So how do we keep on the trail of the optimism in terms of individual quality of life and even societal quality of life, but at the same time with the urge that perhaps that's not sustainable as it is right now, and that perhaps some things should be shifted. And always with climate change, I feel this sense of urge and feeling like I am not able to face this. Of course, we try to recycle our garbage and walk the dog and all of that, but that's nothing to the size of the phenomenon. So do you think there is a possible way to shift that huge perspective of economic growth and wealth against such a fast and accelerated phenomenon that is going on? What is your feeling on, are you optimistic, even with the amazing amount of data that, for me, I was shocked with the data and thought it's too tough.
Well, to start with, I basically agree, actually, with Steven Pinker about the shape of history, which is to say, the world is a remarkably more prosperous and fulfilling place than it was even 30 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and absolutely 500 years ago. In a place like the US, this perspective is not so common, actually. We tend to think things are frustrating and stagnated. But when you take in the global picture and you see just how many fewer people are living in absolute poverty, even just over the last 2 decades, how many more women are finishing high school, how many fewer mothers are dying in childbirth, how many fewer children are dying in childbirth. These very basic measures of human well-being are accelerating rapidly. But most of them have accelerated powered by industrialization. The reason that the world is now much wealthier and more prosperous than it was a generation ago is because the developing world developed. And mostly that's meant burning much more fossil fuel and producing much more carbon emissions. And for a long time, this was seen as a real challenge for anyone who was quite scared about climate change, because from a moral perspective, you wouldn't want to ask, say, the nations of Southeast Asia to develop less quickly and keep more of their citizens in poverty, or the nations of South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa the same, for the sake of a better planet, especially if the people making that ask were people who were living in the global north, in Western Europe and the US, people who had benefited enormously from previous generations of the burning of fossil fuels. And on some level, this seemed a kind of unovercomable obstacle. we couldn't, in good conscience, choose to make the world poorer and more full of suffering in order to stabilize the climate. And yet we also knew that if we didn't stabilize the climate, the whole world would be suffering quite dramatically. Now, thankfully, actually some of this thinking has really shifted in the last couple of years, in part because renewable energy has gotten so much cheaper. Something like a 70% decline over the last 5 years, much faster declines than even its biggest backers would have told you to expect a decade or two ago. And that means that in many parts of the world, it's now just as cheap to run renewable energy as it is to run dirty energy. And in certain parts of the world, it's even cheaper to build new renewable infrastructure than it is to continue running dirty infrastructure, which is kind of mind-blowing. And that means that even for countries who are, who are struggling to bring their populations out of poverty, it is no longer the case that they feel they have to choose between growing more rapidly and growing more responsibly. They can now see a path towards quicker growth that is also more responsible growth. And I think the sort of paradigmatic example of that is the government of Indonesia, which is it's a country that's over the last 2 decades doubled its per capita income, halved its poverty rate, but doubled its carbon emissions because it grew that way through industrialization. They now say that they can halve their carbon emissions by 2030 and still grow at 6% per year, which is faster than the 5% they've grown over the last 2 decades. Now, this is comforting to me because I'm not sure that I want to live in a world in which we totally reorient our priorities away from economic growth. I do think that promises of future prosperity have been incredibly powerful comforts to all of us alive in the world over the last century. And I think that the benefits that we enjoy now because we're wealthy are if not incalculable, then quite enormous. We often take them for granted, but the gains that we've made in public health and female educational empowerment, all that kind of stuff is really remarkable. And you wouldn't want to freeze that or go back. You want to continue that story. The question is, can we continue that story without destroying the planet? And I think that what is required is some kind of profound renovation of what we think of as capitalism. And there's been some efforts in some economic, some parts of the academy, economists suggesting that we should replace GDP with a measure of economic growth that more accounts for a holistic sense of individual well-being. And in fact, the remarkable Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, is trying to do exactly that. She's actually trying to use a different economic measure because she doesn't believe GDP reflects everything that we need to value in this world. But I also think that, those on the environmental left who want to essentially retire growth in order to deal with climate change may be undermining their own project, because among the other things that have happened over the last century is that the human impacts of natural disasters have fallen actually considerably. Now they're ticking back up again because the disasters have gotten so much worse just over the last few years. But an out-of-control monsoon or hurricane in India or the Caribbean in the early part of the 20th century would have been they were many times more destructive than the ones that we have today, because we have a much more resilient infrastructure, we have much stronger political economies, and we have many more resources to throw at these disasters when they happen. I don't want to personally prioritize growth at the expense of mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change, but I think if we are thinking we should retire growth, we may be retiring one of the tools that we need in order to deal with this warming future. And we'll see if we can imagine our way or build a way towards a more sustainable economic system. I think there are some sort of easy steps to take. The IMF, which is no left-wing environmental organization, says that globally we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business $5.3 trillion a year. There's no reason to be subsidizing these businesses because they're poisoning the planet. And in fact, if you know, I'm a lefty, but nevertheless, like if you think about like withdrawing those subsidies, that's not like an end to capitalism. Actually, that's sort of like a restoration of a more free market approach. In general, I think that we're not going to be approaching this story when it comes to the economics of it, or the politics of it, or the geopolitics of it, or the culture of it in any single way. I think there are going to be parts of the world that respond to climate change with naked economic opportunism. There are going to be others that prioritize growth, but in a much more healthy and sustainable way. And there are others that probably will be so beaten back by the impacts of climate change that they don't have much hope of economic growth at all. And in fact, there are a lot of countries around the equator now who, over the last generation, have lost as much as a quarter of their potential GDP because of climate change already. And it's been estimated that by the end of the century, that global south as a whole, if we don't change course, could be dealing with an economic picture that would allow them no hope of economic growth at all. So their best year for a country like India, say, by the end of the century, would be a 0.0 year of economic growth, and many years they'd be dealing with worse impacts than that. So I think we're going to see, in general, a story that is not neat. It's quite messy, with things moving in many directions all at once. But overall, that climate will be the defining meta-narrative that governs all of our stories, all of our lives going forward this century. It's too big a set of transformations, too dramatic a challenge to the way that we live for anybody who's alive on the planet, say 50 years from now, to be unaffected by its force.
Yes, you point out a thing in the book that it's quite interesting, is how fear has allowed many moments in history to shift dramatically collective decisions to turn around the things. For example, World War II was like a phenomena that in a moment everybody thought that we were all going to be invaded by Germany. And at the end, there was a moment where a lot of society says we have to stop this, and then in a moment there was a shift that changed the narrative of that story. Or even the Cold War was a moment where it was kind of imminent that there was going to be a nuclear war, and then how the tension and the fear became into measurements that became in global treaties on the control of nuclear weapons and all of that. So in a way, it's like fear has been able to shift the things in a specific moment and make societies to move forward on that direction. So you mentioned, you have said in other interviews and even in the book that perhaps if we have the same sense of a fear that this is imminent, that this is coming for us, that the thing is happening, and that we're going to suffer the consequences of the climate change, that will be a good way to make societies to change their perspective and at the same time to push the changes. The only thing that I concern on this, and I don't have any answer to that, is that it's still being abstract to everybody, like not that clear that on a daily basis. How many news do we have every day around climate change? And usually we see the news of the consequences, but not the causes, like a natural disaster or something like that. So people is not adding tension around the core problem. So how do we make that this fear, if you like, but it's not false fear, it's a real fear. So let's say how we face the data, which is the reality, in a more comprehensive way that we understand, oh, this is adding to this same problem, and not only through the evidences that there's no always a David Wells around us to say this is connected with that, this is connected with that, this has to be with that. That's for me like a big challenge, to interconnect all the things happening to a single thing that makes us to move forward and try to change the things. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I come to this story as a journalist, and so the question of how to best communicate the scale and urgency of the crisis in a way that motivates action is, for me, sort of at best a secondary or tertiary concern, and my main preoccupation is just showcasing the state of knowledge in the scientific community, which is truly terrifying. And I think that when reality is scary or promises to be scary, it's the only responsible thing for a journalist to do to try to share that story with the public. I think it would be quite patronizing to try to edit that message and, put a more hopeful spin on things. But I think that's exactly what's happened over the last generation, when many scientists and many advocates were really worried about making people give up. Like, if we were truly honest about what we were facing, everybody would just abandon hope entirely and totally disengage. And as a result, many of those people, those scientists and those advocates and those journalists, were not.
A word for that, like climate fatigue.
Yeah, I think of it almost as fatalism. But yeah, it can be destructive to people who have been staring at this for so long and have seen so little progress. You see it in the community of professionals for sure. But I think that when I look at the global picture, I see so many more people, as you say, who are living in more complacent ways than I see people who are at risk of truly falling into despair. I mean, just obviously, looking around the world, there's hardly anybody who's living in a way that reflects the urgency of this crisis. I mean, maybe you could say Greta Thunberg, but like, I don't. I mean, I don't live in perfect alignment with the scale of the crisis. Nobody I know who works in the field does, because the truth is it's quite hard to live in the modern world and still act responsibly on these issues in a perfectly responsible way. So I think to a certain degree we're all complacent and we're all living in denial. And as someone who was living in much deeper complacency and was awakened out of that by fear, I think there is value in alarming people. I don't think it's the only way to talk about this story, but I think it is helpful. And I think that the responsibility, so I think about that dilemma and that challenge as a journalist, primarily as a journalist. I also think the failure has been a failure of journalism as much as of scientists and of politics, which is to say, when the nightly news covers a natural disaster, they rarely talk about climate change. In the US, it's been really a vivid contrast between the way that print media, newspapers, has started writing about climate change over the last few years, when they're covering it very aggressively now, actually, and the way that TV media has, where they are basically ignoring it still. And I think you see that pattern playing out in a lot of parts of the world, where certain sectors of the journalism industry takes climate very seriously, but the everyday citizen isn't encountering the dot connecting that you're talking about in a way that would really inform them. On the other hand, extreme weather is sort of teaching us those lessons itself. 3 years ago, you would have said that climate change was a story of the future. In fact, the subtitle of my book in England is literally a story of the future. But while it has been affecting countries in the global south now for a few decades, it really has shown up in a much more dramatic way all around the world just in the last 2 years. And as a result, I think many more people are finding it harder and harder to look away than could just a few years ago. They may not know what exactly is the relationship between climate change and the intensity of a hurricane, or what exactly is the relationship between climate change and the wildfires in Australia. But on some level, the details are less important to understand than the fact that, in general, climate change is making the natural environment much more hostile to absolutely every aspect of human life. And we are at a quite critical period where we have just about a decade left to take action that would allow us to avoid what scientists call the truly terrifying outcomes, which means that if we're just beginning to see these impacts now, we have to act immediately. I think that perception is growing because of how nature is teaching us through its brutality, through its horror, through its punishment, but it's still teaching us. Now the question is how we respond to those lessons, and whether we process it at an emotional, philosophical, existential level, or whether we process it into politics and actually make policy changes that would allow us to change the trajectory of this story. And I think on that question, there are two really different answers. You know, when I turned in my book, the manuscript of my book, it was September 2018, not that long ago, just about a year and a half, less than a year and a half. I had never heard of Greta Thunberg. Nobody outside of Sweden had heard of her. Basically, nobody in Sweden had heard of her because she had just started protesting like a month before. She was a literally friendless, socially awkward 15-year-old with a single sign sitting outside, all by herself sitting outside the Swedish parliament. Now, you know, a year plus later, she's led a global movement in the millions. She's excoriated leaders at, you know, in the British Parliament, at Davos, at the EU, at the UN. A year ago, I never heard of Extinction Rebellion. Now they've made the British Parliament declare a climate emergency and commit to zero carbon by 2050. And that action shamed the governments of Finland and Norway and Denmark into making even more ambitious pledges. In the US, I never heard of the Sunrise Movement, which is our equivalent of the school strikes. We had not elected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress. We were not talking about a Green New Deal. And now we're in a presidential primary in which all of the Democratic candidates are competing with one another to see who could be more ambitious on climate. And even the most retrograde one, Joe Biden, is miles more ambitious about climate than his predecessor, Barack Obama, was. And he's considered the one who's hopelessly retrograde. The people who are actually considered out in front of the issue, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, are trafficking in proposals that would have gotten them laughed out of the room, not just 20 years ago, but 18 months ago. And that change is unbelievably rapid. It's exciting not just because it means so much more is possible now, but because it means that if we continue that path, things that today still seem impossible may seem quite doable 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. And we need that kind of transformation because actually, at the baseline level, and this is the other story you could tell about whether we're leveraging the natural disasters and the way that nature is teaching us to fear the future into policy changes, we're making no progress at all. Last year, we set a new global carbon emissions record. The year before, we set a new carbon emissions record. The year before that, we set a new carbon emissions record. We're going to set a new one this year. Coal use is still at an all-time high. All of these countries have made pledges. Very few of them have put together any legislation that will allow them to actually hit those pledges. There are signs of progress here and there, but if you take seriously the UN's statement that we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 to have a hope of avoiding catastrophic warming, and that in order to do that, we need a World War II scale mobilization globally against climate starting last year, you know that nothing that any country in the world has achieved politically is anything close to what we need to do. They say we need to cut our emissions by 7% every year globally. 7% decline in emissions is something that no single country has ever achieved in any single year in world history. And the UN says that we need to do that, that every single nation in the world has to do that every single year for the next decade to have a hope of avoiding catastrophic warming. So even though we're seeing incredible political momentum and incredible growth in public awareness beyond anything I thought was even possible a year ago, nevertheless, we need a whole lot more than that to even bring us into, into range of the goals that the UN has set for us. And so I think the likely outcome is that we make some progress, we take some action, but we still find ourselves living in a future that, while it's much better than worst case scenario, is nevertheless defined in some quite profound ways by unprecedented human suffering produced by climate change. And in fact, that will be the story of the 21st century, how the planet as a whole is totally reshaped, and all the ways that we live on it totally transformed by climate.
Bueno, creo que tienen que leerse el libro.
Richard Feynman decía que si ocurría un gran desastre, o le preguntaban que si ocurría un gran desastre y desaparecía todo lo que sabíamos de ciencia, ¿qué rescataría él? ¿Qué información rescataría él que fuera valiosa y difícil de conseguir? Él dijo que la idea del átomo. Entonces la pregunta que yo tendría para hacerte es si has pensado en el hecho de que si ocurre un gran desastre y una gran mortandad, y estamos hablando de un futuro, por ejemplo, de 1000 años, porque tú en el libro mencionas que el problema puede extenderse a 1000 años, ¿qué lección deberíamos rescatar y transmitirle a los niños para que no cometamos el mismo error? De la misma manera que estamos tratando de rescatar las lecciones de la Segunda Guerra Mundial para que no vuelva a ocurrir ese desastre. ¿Qué lección tendríamos que rescatar para que no vuelva a ocurrir este desastre?
Well, I think it's a little misleading, I think, to think of the problem as a single climate disaster. I think that it's big enough and will last long enough that we're going to be living in a world defined by it almost no matter what we do. But I think that the most important lesson to take from it and to pass along to our children is one of empathy. These are impacts that are distributed unequally. Parts of the world are already suffering enormously from climate change, but many of us don't pay all that close attention to those suffering there because we're focused on the well-being of those closer to us. And I think that climate change teaches us something that we should all know anyway, which is that we are a single humanity. We have a shared fate on this one home, and we should operate to the extent that we can with the well-being of every person on the planet in mind, so that a wealthy person in the US can't look at a flooded Bangladesh and turn away and not care, but respond, maybe not as though those people are their own family members, but at least in the same way that they might to people living within their own nation's borders. I think that climate change is a great instructor about our shared humanity, and that we should do whatever we can to learn that lesson, because it will motivate us to take the kinds of action that we need to take to preserve as much well-being on the planet as we possibly can.
Since they didn't take away the microphone, I'm going to just one more question quickly. Doesn't this challenge Darwinism? Doesn't this go against our speech?
Más exitosa de la Tierra, y es la especie que está enfrentando la extinción. Esto no desafía el darwinismo. Yo sé que tú no eres un biólogo evolutivo, pero esto no desafía el darwinismo.
Well, first of all, I don't think that we're facing extinction. I think we're just facing an enormous amount of human suffering. But I think it is an adaptive challenge, and whether we are up to that challenge is an open question. I think in parts of the West, at least, we fancied ourselves true conquerors of nature over the last century or so, and climate change shows that that was a delusion, but that we need to change our ways in order to live more comfortably in line with nature. If we don't, there will be quite a lot of suffering and dying. In fact, there already is. And humanity, the meaning of human life and our primacy on the planet will be defined by those choices. You know, because of climate change, we're now living through what's called the 6th mass extinction in the planet's history. The previous 4 of them were also produced by changes in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, producing dramatic temperature changes, 4 of the 5 previous mass extinctions, and the worst of which killed 97% of all life on Earth. We're now adding carbon to the atmosphere 10 times faster than the fastest of those mass extinctions. Now, I think humans are incredibly adaptable and incredibly resilient, and I don't think that we will ourselves go extinct. In fact, I think we will probably find ways to preserve some significant chunk of the ecosystems that we depend on. But if we're living on a world in which, 60% of all life has been destroyed because of climate change, that will very much, I think, change the way that we think about just how successful humanity has been as a steward of the planet.
Lo primero es preguntar que, pues teniendo en cuenta que Estados Unidos, ahorita estás hablando del optimismo y de cómo tenemos que ser de cierta manera optimistas frente a esto del cambio climático. Con esto de que Estados Unidos se salió de la cumbre de París, esto cada vez genera como, que me ponga a pie. con esto de, pues, de que Estados Unidos se salió de la cumbre de París, esto genera como más miedo y más, no sé cómo decirlo, como angustia frente a ese tema. El caso es que tanta angustia y tanto miedo nos ha llenado tanto que cada vez que nosotros vemos una noticia frente al cambio climático en internet o vemos que se extinguió una especie, uno se siente mal como 5 minutos y al rato se le pasa todo, porque ya se volvió muy común este pesimismo. Entonces, ¿cómo hacer para intentar evitar esto? Y también, pues ya aprovechando que tengo el micrófono, es para preguntar que si nuestros esfuerzos se deberían enfocar en tratar de evitar lo que ya es casi inevitable o prepararnos para lo que viene.
Well, on the second question, I think we need to do both. We're going to be living in a very different world. We need to prepare for that. But the more that we can reduce our carbon emissions more quickly, the less dramatic the changes we'll be dealing with down the road will be. So I think we need to do both at maximum speed everywhere we can. On the sort of more complicated first question, the U.S. leadership on this issue has been really abominable. I think that's inarguable. As a country, we're responsible for the lion's share, the biggest share of historical emissions. We still have the highest per capita share of carbon emissions, even though China as a nation now produces almost twice as much as the U.S. And the Paris Accord was basically dictated by the U.S. Many of the things that other nations in the world wanted to put into that agreement that would make it more binding were left out because the U.S. objected, and then the U.S. walked away anyway. It's horrible. On the other hand, while all the other 180 nations are still parties to the Paris Accords, none of them are on track to meet their commitments under those accords. Not a single major industrial nation is on track to keep its commitments to Paris. The only 2 countries in the world whose trajectory since Paris, which was just 3 years ago, is considered even compatible with the goal of keeping the world below 2 degrees warming are Morocco and Gambia. No other nation is even considered compatible with the Paris Accords. And so I absolutely think that the US needs to play a much stronger leadership role. I've started to think that it may be useful to think not in terms of a truly international Paris-like approach, but something more on the model of the nuclear non-proliferation agreements that you were mentioning earlier. In this case, it would not be the US and the Soviet Union, but the US and China, which would require a real change of leadership or at least perspective in both of those countries. But there's something really complicated about engineering an agreement in which 180 different parties with different prerogatives and priorities each have veto power over what is agreed to. And I worry that something like the Paris Accords is unsalvageable, even if American leadership returns to the table, which I'm hopeful will happen next November. In terms of whether we should be optimistic or fearful, I think both are important. I think, truthfully, we can't choose between them because we will be living in a world that is defined by pain and suffering, and we have every right to be scared of that. But we also have the opportunity to minimize that amount of pain and suffering if we make the right choices today, if we change our politics in the right direction today. And I think it's important to keep in mind, more generally, that climate change is not a binary system. It's not whether we're going to beat climate change or whether it will beat us. It's not about whether we're totally screwed or we'll be totally fine. Every tick upward of temperature, every 1/10 of every degree, makes a really big difference in how much human suffering is produced down the line. And that will always be the case. Even if we're at a hellish 3 or 4 or 5 degrees, it will still be up to us to limit the amount of future warming and therefore limit the amount of future suffering. And so I like to think not in terms of how much worse it's going to get from here, because I think you're right that does produce a quite despairing, defeated perspective, but how much we can do from now to avoid the path we're on or worst case scenarios. And I think there's quite a lot that we can do and are doing already to make sure that those worst case scenarios don't come to pass. So from my perspective, you have to count that as a victory, even if compared to the world as it is today, we're going to be living with a lot more pain and suffering. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, David. Muchas gracias, David. Una excelente charla.
Y bueno,